October 14th, 2023, 9:17 p.m. 32-year-old Daniel Reeves steps into frame, unaware that a single piece of surveillance footage will later be watched more than 20 times by investigators searching for answers. The camera captures him entering the lobby of his apartment building, pausing briefly near the elevator, glancing toward something off-screen. Nothing about his movements appears unusual. Nothing suggests danger. And yet, within hours, Daniel will vanish without a trace. Police initially believed this footage confirmed a simple timeline: a routine return home. No signs of distress. No indication that anyone else was involved. But buried within those few seconds was something no one noticed. Not the responding officers. Not the detectives. Not even Daniel's own family, who watched the clip over and over again, desperate for clues. It wasn't what the camera showed directly. It was what it reflected. A detail so subtle, so easy to miss, that it quietly hid the truth in plain sight. And when someone finally saw it, everything about Daniel Reeves' disappearance changed. Because the answer had been there the entire time. Everyone was just looking in the wrong place. Daniel Reeves was the kind of person people described as steady. Not flashy, not reckless, not someone who made impulsive decisions. At 32, he had built a life that ran on routine, structure, and quiet consistency. He worked as a systems analyst for a mid-sized logistics company in Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't a job that drew attention, but it was stable, and Daniel liked that. His days followed a pattern that rarely changed. Up at 6:30 a.m., coffee brewed the same way every morning. A 10-minute walk to the parking garage. And always, he arrived at work early. Friends would later tell investigators that Daniel didn't like surprises. He planned things in advance. He double-checked details. Even small decisions, like where to eat or what movie to watch, were considered carefully. It wasn't anxiety. It was control. A way of keeping his world predictable. But this is where things begin to feel different. Because people like Daniel don't just disappear. He lived alone in a third-floor apartment in a secure building on the east side of the city. The kind of place with keycard access, security cameras in every common area, and a front desk that was staffed during the day. At night, entry required a code or a resident letting you in. It was, by all appearances, safe. Daniel had moved there just over a year earlier, after ending a long-term relationship. According to those close to him, the breakup had been mutual. No arguments, no lingering tension. Just two people realizing they wanted different futures. Since then, Daniel had settled into a quieter life. He stayed in touch with a small circle of friends, most of them co-workers or people he'd known since college. They met occasionally for dinner, sometimes on weekends. But Daniel wasn't the type to stay out late. By 10 p.m., he was usually home. His sister, Laura, spoke to him almost every other day. Their conversations were short but consistent. Updates about work, jokes about family, plans for upcoming holidays. She would later say that Daniel sounded exactly the same in their last call as he always did. Calm, focused, unbothered. Nothing in his voice suggested that anything was wrong. And that last day began just like any other. October 14th was a Saturday. Daniel didn't have work, but he still woke up early. Phone records show activity at 6:42 a.m. His usual routine followed. Coffee, a quick grocery run, a stop at a nearby hardware store. Receipts and transaction timestamps confirm each step, mapping out a day that felt entirely ordinary. Around noon, he returned to his apartment. He spent the afternoon inside. His laptop activity shows him logged into a work portal briefly, checking emails, then browsing news sites. At 3:18 p.m., he texted a co-worker about an upcoming project. The message was casual, even slightly humorous. There was no urgency, no tension. But what they didn't notice at the time was how everything about that day fit perfectly into his pattern. Too perfectly. Because by evening, something would break that pattern in a way no one could explain. At 7:56 p.m., Daniel ordered takeout from a nearby restaurant. The delivery driver later confirmed that Daniel answered the door himself. Nothing unusual. No signs of distress. He even made a brief comment about the weather getting colder. Again, normal. At 8:34 p.m., Daniel's phone connects to his apartment's Wi-Fi network after briefly disconnecting. Investigators would later consider this a minor detail, easily overlooked. But timestamps matter, especially when they are one of the last digital footprints someone leaves behind. Because just over 40 minutes later, at 9:17 p.m., Daniel appears on the building's lobby camera. And that is the moment everything hinges on. But to understand why that moment is so important, you have to understand what Daniel never did. He never left without telling someone. He never ignored calls. He never broke routine without a reason. And yet, after that night, there would be no texts, no calls, no financial activity, no digital trace of any kind. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his own life. At first, no one panicked. When Daniel didn't respond the next morning, friends assumed he was busy. Maybe he had gone out. Maybe he was catching up on sleep. It wasn't like him, but it wasn't alarming. Not yet. By Sunday afternoon, concern started to build. His sister called multiple times. No answer. By Sunday evening, that concern turned into something heavier. Because Daniel always called back. Always. On Monday morning, when he failed to show up for work without notice, his manager reached out. Emails went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. That was the moment when routine turned into absence. And absence turned into alarm. A welfare check was requested that afternoon. Officers arrived at Daniel's apartment just after 3 p.m. The door was locked. No signs of forced entry. Inside, everything appeared exactly as it should be. His wallet was on the counter. His keys were near the door. His laptop was open on the desk. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing, except Daniel. And this is where the case begins to fracture. Because if Daniel had left voluntarily, he would have taken something. His phone, his wallet, his car. But all of it was still there. Even more concerning, his phone was later found inside the apartment, resting on the kitchen counter, its battery nearly drained. Which means when he appeared on that lobby camera at 9:17 p.m., he had already left behind the one thing he never went anywhere without. And no one noticed that detail at first. Investigators initially treated the situation as a possible voluntary disappearance. Adults leave. It happens. Without signs of struggle or forced entry. There was no immediate evidence of a crime. But something didn't sit right. Because Daniel didn't fit that pattern. And then there was the footage. The camera in the lobby showed him clearly. Walking in. Calm. Controlled. No visible distress. He pauses briefly, as if thinking, then steps toward the elevator. That footage became the anchor of the investigation. It told a simple story. Too simple. Because what no one realized at the time was that the most important part of that footage wasn't Daniel at all. It was something else. Something small. Something hidden. Something that would only become visible much later. But when it did, it wouldn't just change the timeline. It would change everything they thought they knew about that night. By the time investigators began building a formal timeline, the case still appeared straightforward. Daniel Reeves entered his apartment building at 9:17 p.m. That much was certain. The lobby camera captured it clearly, time-stamped down to the second. The footage begins with the glass front doors sliding open. Daniel steps inside, wearing a dark jacket, his posture relaxed, his pace unhurried. He doesn't look behind him. He doesn't hesitate. He moves like someone who has done this exact routine hundreds of times before. At 9:17 and 8 seconds p.m., he crosses the lobby floor. At 9:17 and 12 seconds p.m., he briefly slows near the mailboxes. At 9:17 and 15 seconds p.m., he turns his head slightly to the right. And then, at 9:17 and 18 seconds p.m., he continues toward the elevator. Nothing unusual. At least, that's how it was interpreted. Investigators reviewed the footage multiple times during the first 48 hours. They noted his clothing, his body language, the absence of anyone entering behind him, the lack of visible interaction. Everything pointed to a normal return home. And that assumption shaped everything that followed. Because if Daniel made it back inside safely, then whatever happened next must have occurred after he reached his apartment. That became the working theory. Officers shifted focus to the building itself. They pulled additional camera angles, hallway footage, elevator logs, entry and exit points. They mapped every movement that could be tracked. But this is where things start to break. There was no footage of Daniel exiting the building. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not at any point afterward. Every external camera was checked. The garage. The rear service entrance. Even neighboring buildings that might have captured a partial view. Nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished somewhere between the lobby and his front door. But that didn't make sense. Because inside his apartment, there were no signs of disturbance, no indication of a struggle, no evidence that anyone else had been there. His belongings were untouched. His environment was frozen in place, exactly as it had been hours earlier, which forced investigators into a narrow conclusion. If Daniel didn't leave and no one entered, then whatever happened must have been voluntary. And that's where the case took its first wrong turn. Because once that assumption settled in, everything began to align around it. Detectives looked for reasons Daniel might have chosen to disappear. Financial stress, personal issues, hidden conflicts. They found none. His bank accounts showed no unusual withdrawals. His credit cards hadn't been used. There were no secret transactions, no unexplained communications, no sudden behavioral changes in the days leading up to his disappearance. Still, the theory held, because the alternative was harder to accept. Meanwhile, Daniel's family pushed back. His sister insisted something was wrong. She emphasized his routine, his predictability, the fact that he would never leave without his phone or wallet. She repeated it in every conversation with investigators. He would not just walk away. But without clear evidence of a crime, the investigation slowed. Days turned into weeks. The footage remained the centerpiece. It was reviewed again and again, but always with the same conclusion. Daniel entered alone. He appeared calm. There were no visible threats. The case began to cool. And then, nearly 3 weeks later, a break came from an unexpected direction. A private security consultant named Marcus Hale was brought in by the property management company, not to solve the case, but to audit the building's surveillance system. Standard procedure after an incident like this. Marcus had spent years analyzing video systems, identifying blind spots, and reconstructing timelines. His job wasn't to investigate crimes, but to understand how cameras see, and more importantly, what they miss. He requested access to the original lobby footage, not the edited clips, not the summaries, the raw file. At first, he watched it the same way everyone else had. Daniel enters. Daniel pauses. Daniel walks toward the elevator. Nothing unusual. But Marcus wasn't focused on Daniel. He was focused on the frame itself, the lighting, the angles, the reflections. Because cameras don't just capture what's directly in front of them. They capture everything that interacts with light. And that includes things no one is looking at. This is where everything begins to shift. Marcus slows the footage down frame by frame. At 9:17 and 12 seconds p.m., Daniel passes the row of metal mailboxes along the wall. The surface is slightly reflective, not a mirror, but enough to catch distorted shapes and movement. At normal speed, it means nothing. But slow down. Something changes. Marcus pauses the video, rewinds, plays it again. There is a shape, faint, distorted, but present. At first, it looks like a shadow, something caused by the overhead lights. But shadows don't move independently. This does. And that's the moment the entire case begins to unravel. Because what Marcus is seeing doesn't match the official narrative. It suggests something else was there, something no one noticed. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Marcus flags the timestamp and reports his findings. At first, investigators are skeptical. The footage had already been reviewed extensively, multiple times, by trained professionals. But Marcus insists. He requests a full re-examination. Reluctantly, detectives agree. They return to the footage, this time not watching Daniel, watching everything else. And suddenly, details begin to emerge that were never part of the original investigation. Subtle movements, inconsistent reflections, tiny distortions that don't align with a single person walking alone through the lobby. The conclusion they had built begins to crack. Because if Daniel wasn't alone in that moment, then everything that followed was based on the wrong assumption. And that means the timeline, the theory, the entire direction of the investigation was wrong. But the most important question still remains. If someone else was there, why didn't anyone see them? And more importantly, how did they manage to stay invisible in a room full of cameras? The answer was already in the footage, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally look in the right place. And when they did, it didn't just reveal a presence, it revealed intent. When detectives reopened the footage, they approached it differently, not as confirmation of what they already believed, but as something that might contradict it. Marcus Hale sat with them in a dimly lit review room, the original file pulled up again. This time, every second was slowed, every frame examined without assumption. The focus was no longer Daniel Reeves walking through the lobby. It was everything around him. At 9:17 and 12 seconds p.m., the moment Marcus had flagged, the video pauses. Daniel is mid-step, his body angled slightly toward the elevator. To his right, the row of brushed metal mailboxes catches the overhead light. The reflection is faint, warped, easy to ignore at full speed. But slowed down, something appears. A second shape, not behind Daniel, not beside him in the open space, only in the reflection. At first glance, it doesn't make sense. The figure is distorted by the curvature of the metal surface, stretched and compressed into something almost abstract. But it moves independently of Daniel. That is the detail that changes everything. Because reflections don't create movement on their own. There is someone else in that lobby, standing just outside the camera's direct field of view. This is where everything changes. The room goes quiet as the footage plays again, frame by frame. The second figure shifts slightly, just enough to confirm presence. A shoulder, the outline of a head, a position that places them near the wall, just beyond what the main camera captures. And suddenly, the impossible becomes plausible. Daniel wasn't alone. He was being watched. Investigators begin reconstructing the geometry of the lobby. Camera angles, blind spots, light sources. They realize something critical almost immediately. The primary camera is mounted high, angled toward the entrance and elevator corridor. It covers the center of the room, but not the narrow strip along the wall where the mailboxes are installed. There is a gap, small, precise, easy to overlook, and someone had found it. The second figure is standing exactly in that blind spot, positioned where the camera cannot see them directly, but the reflection betrays their presence. Which raises a question that hadn't been asked before. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Because you don't accidentally stand in the one place a camera can't see you. You choose it. The footage is enhanced, contrast adjusted, shadows lifted. Each frame becomes clearer, not in detail, but in certainty. The figure is real. And at 9:17 and 15 seconds p.m., something even more significant happens. Daniel turns his head slightly to the right. At normal speed, it looked like nothing. A casual glance, a natural movement. But now, in context, it becomes something else entirely. He's not glancing randomly. He's reacting to someone standing just out of sight. Everyone was watching the wrong thing. For weeks, investigators had focused on Daniel's calm demeanor, interpreting it as proof that nothing was wrong. But calm doesn't mean unaware, and routine doesn't mean safe. Because what the footage now suggests is something far more controlled. An encounter. Subtle, quiet, planned. Daniel pauses for just over a second. Not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to acknowledge presence. Then he continues toward the elevator, and the reflection shifts again. The second figure moves, not into view, but closer, maintaining the blind spot. Following him, this single detail rewrites the entire case, because it explains what never made sense. Why Daniel left his phone behind. Why there were no signs of forced entry. Why no one saw him leave. He didn't leave. Not on his own. Investigators pivot immediately. The building's access logs are pulled again, but this time with a different focus. Not just who entered and exited, but who had the knowledge to navigate the building without being seen. Residents, staff, maintenance, anyone familiar with the layout. One name begins to surface repeatedly. Ethan Cole, a contracted maintenance technician who had been working in the building for several months. His responsibilities included electrical repairs, camera maintenance, and access system troubleshooting, which meant he knew exactly where the cameras were, and more importantly, where they weren't. At first, Ethan had not raised concern. His work logs showed routine activity, minor repairs, scheduled visits, nothing unusual. He had access to multiple areas of the building, including service corridors and utility rooms that weren't covered by surveillance. But now, with a new understanding of the footage, his presence becomes harder to ignore. Records show he was in the building that evening, signed in at 8:02 p.m. No recorded sign-out time. That detail had been overlooked, just like the reflection. Investigators bring Ethan in for questioning. His initial responses are calm, consistent. He confirms he was working on a lighting issue on the second floor. He claims he left through a rear service exit around 9:30 p.m. But there is no footage of that. And now, there is something else. When confronted with the enhanced stills from the lobby reflection, Ethan hesitates. It's brief, but it's enough, because people can control what they say, not always how they react. Further analysis begins. Keycard data shows a service-level access door opening at 9:18 p.m., 1 minute after Daniel enters the lobby. That door leads to a restricted corridor connecting to the elevator system, a path invisible to the main cameras. This is where the timeline locks into place. Daniel enters at 9:17. He acknowledges someone just out of view. He moves toward the elevator, and within 60 seconds, he is intercepted. Not in the open lobby, but in the one place no camera could see. The investigation accelerates. A search warrant is executed at Ethan Cole's residence. Items are recovered that link him directly to Daniel. Personal belongings, digital traces, evidence that had no explanation under the original theory. Under pressure, the story begins to collapse. Ethan had studied the building, learned its blind spots, understood its routines. He knew when the lobby would be empty. He knew where to stand to remain unseen. And he knew exactly how to approach someone without causing alarm. Because from Daniel's perspective, there was no immediate threat. Just a familiar face. A building employee. Someone who belonged there. That was the advantage. And it's why Daniel didn't react the way people expected. Because by the time he realized something was wrong, he was already out of sight. Months after Daniel Reeves disappeared, his case finally moved toward resolution. Charges were filed, evidence was presented, and the timeline, once built on a single assumption, was reconstructed piece by piece. All because of a reflection most people never noticed. The footage that had been watched 20 times had been misunderstood 20 times, until someone looked at what wasn't obvious. In the end, the truth wasn't hidden by darkness or distance. It was hidden by attention. Everyone was focused on the subject. No one questioned the background. And that is what allowed the most important detail to remain invisible. Until it didn't. Daniel's story is not just about what happened that night. It's about how easily the truth can exist in plain sight. How something small can carry the weight of an entire case. And how sometimes the answer isn't in what you see. It's in what you almost miss. Because in this case, justice didn't come from new evidence. It came from seeing old evidence differently. If you look closely enough, long enough, the truth has a way of revealing itself, even in a reflection.